Hermann Axen was born on March 6, 1916, in Leipzig, in the German Empire. Axen's father worked as a sales representative. His family adhered to the liberal branch of Judaism. A year after his bar mitzvah, he horrified his parents by renouncing religion. In 1932, inspired by his brother Rudolf, he joined the Young Communists. He was deeply affected by his brother's murder by the Gestapo, which took place at the main police station in Dresden on September 23, 1933. The body was handed over to his parents shortly after the execution. According to autobiography written by Axen in 1949, and later found in his party file, his parents were killed by the Nazis around 1939 or 1940 in a ghetto or concentration camp near Lvov, or as the Germans called it, Lemberg, now Lviv in western Ukraine. Hermann also undertook a course at the Marxist Workers' Academy in Leipzig in 1932 and 1933, after which he took on a leadership role in the youth section in the party's Leipzig sub-district. When he was 17, he served as an illegal resistance worker, a party instructor, and a party contact in Saxony. Between March and November of 1934, he undertook and completed a commercial apprenticeship with Hofner, Moses & Co., a fur trading company. By June 1934, he was also responsible for agitation and propaganda, or agitprop, for the local leadership for Leipzig west of the underground Young Communists, identified among comrades by the code names, Max, and subsequently, Friedrich. In September 1934 he joined the Young Communists Leipzig region leadership team. Their group had by this point been effectively destroyed through arrests, and Axen now teamed up with a fellow young communist called Heinz Mislitz to try and rebuild the group. He was arrested, along with 14 others, on November 3, 1934. He presented himself as a Polish citizen and a disciple of their Mosaic religious community. His papers were convincing for the arrest to trigger an intervention by the Polish consulate in Leipzig. On June 20, 1935, he faced the district high court in Dresden. The charge, preparing to commit high treason. He was convicted and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment at the old penitentiary at Zwickau, near the modern German border with the Czech Republic. He'd already served 7 months of his sentence while in pre-trial detention, and he was released in November 1937. This might have been because he presented himself to the authorities as a Polish citizen in 1934, but potentially on account of his communist activism, and his Jewish family roots, and by this time he'd been stripped of any remaining German citizenship rights, and he was released on the condition he immediately left Germany. He was now stateless, and with their agreement of the party, he headed for Vienna, which involved traveling via Poland. By this time it was no secret that Adolf Hitler, backed by popular support in Germany and Austria, saw the independent Austrian state as an anomaly, and with the Anschluss approaching, Hermann fled to Paris in January 1938. Since 1933, Paris had informally served as one of 2 headquarter locations for the German Communist Party in exile. Until 1940, he took casual work, working in a support capacity in a number of businesses, while at the same time undertaking courier jobs for members of the illegal German Communist Party's leadership. From April 1938, he was taking on red-aid jobs for the German Young Communists, and also undertaking translation jobs for German Freedom Radio 29.8. The Second World War broke out on September 1, 1939, when the German army invaded Poland, and the French and British governments declared war on Germany. But on the streets of Paris, not much changed until May 1940, when the Germans overran northern France. The authorities responded by summarily identifying a large number of German political and racial refugees from Nazism as enemy aliens and interning them, in the first instance, in a large Paris football stadium and subsequently in the Drancy internment camp. Possibly in connection with his legal stateless status, Axen avoided this and managed to escape to southern France, where a puppet government had been established under the leadership of World War I hero Marshal Philippe Pétain. Later that month, he was exposed as a stateless communist, and arrested and interned in Camp Vernet, a vast holding camp in the mountains to the west of Perpignan, in southwestern France, a place previously used to house returning fighters from the Spanish Civil War. In June 1940, the authorities reassigned the camp, which was now to be used to accommodate all foreigners considered suspect or dangerous to the public order. By the end of May 1940, it is thought Axen was one of at least 250 Camp Vernet inmates who were German-speaking political exiles, and the next 2 years he spent at the camp gave him great networking opportunities with some of the people who would later become leading members of the leadership in the German Democratic Republic in late 1949. Throughout the war, the Vichy government became increasingly marginalized, and by 1942, Gestapo officers were a regular sight on the streets of the cities in southern France. Security at Vernet no longer relied on its remote location, and the camp was being described as a holding center for Jewish families awaiting deportation to labor and extermination camps. In August 1942, Axen and various other internees picked out as Jewish communists, including future journalist and broadcast director Kurt Goldstein, were handed over to the Gestapo, sent to the Paris area and placed on Convoy 18 on August 12. He was held for more than 2 days at the main Auschwitz-Birkenau camp before being allocated to a sub-camp at Jafischewitz, where he was forced to work underground in the coal mines for the next 2 years. At least one historical source tells us that as Hermann Axen rose in the East German political and media hierarchy, his role during his time in the Nazi concentration camp system was often greatly exaggerated. For the 15th edition of his so-called autobiography, a ghostwriter presented a scene that involved Axen, armed with a machine pistol, storming an SS watchtower. This is believed to be a complete fabrication. German political scientist and author Manfred Uschner worked closely with Axen during the 1960s and 70s. And described Axen as a concentration camp inmate as very cool and reserved. In the concentration camp, as a relatively young comrade, he played no significant role, or at least not a strikingly positive one, Uschner had said. The Auschwitz concentration camp was emptied of its inmates as the Red Army advanced from the east, after its liberation on January 27, 1945, and Axen was among the survivors transferred to Buchenwald near Weimar. It was reported that he was a member of the illegal Communist Party leadership team in the camp. As the war neared its end in April 1945, it was U.S. troops that eventually liberated Axen from the Buchenwald camp. Although the region of central southern Germany that included both Buchenwald and Axen's home city of Leipzig was liberated by U.S. forces, the victorious Allies had already agreed a post-war territorial division of Germany, where the entire central portion of the country would be administered as the Soviet occupation zone, with the bulk of the Far Eastern regions given to Poland. The Americans pulled their troops back to the agreed lines on their maps in July 1945. And by August 1945 Axen had been installed as head of the Youth Committee with the appointed City Council of the Soviet-administered Leipzig and as a member of the regional leadership team of the local Communist Party. Between October 1945 and February 1946, he was head of the Youth Committee for the entire Saxony region. In April 1946, he was one of thousands of Communist Party members who signed their party membership over to the newly formed Socialist Unity Party, or SED in German. The SED was formed through a contentious merger of the Communist Party and the less Moscow-oriented Social Democratic Party. Its promoters may have hoped that the merger would take effect across Germany as a whole, but it was only possible to obtain the support necessary for it to happen in the Soviet occupation zone, where the SED quickly emerged as the permanent ruling party in a one-party dictatorship. In 1946, Axen also co-founded the Anti-Fascist Youth Committee, but of greater long-term importance was his role as co-founder, together with Paul Werner and Erich Honecker, of the Free German Youth, or FDJ in German, which very quickly became the youth wing of the ruling SED. Between March 1946 and February 1949, he served as secretary to the FDJ National Council. In 1948, he became a member of the People's Council, a precursor parliament set up in the Soviet occupation zone, and mandated to develop and endorse a constitution for the new Germany, based on a draft document issued by the SED in 1945. In the early 1950s, the People's Council gave way to the People's Chamber, a national parliament. At this point, he wasn't a member. In 1954, he finally became a member, holding one of the 17 seats allocated for SED members representing the Greater Berlin region. In 1971, he took over from Rudolf Axen as chair of the Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee. Axen remained a member of the People's Chamber until November 16, 1989, when his parliamentary mandate was revoked by a resolution of the party of Hermann Axen. In October 1949, the Soviet occupation zone was re-established as the Soviet-sponsored German Democratic Republic, better known as East Germany. Hermann Axen became a member of the party executive the same year, and he remained an important member as it evolved into the Central Committee. From 1949, he was in charge of the Central Committee's Agitprop department. Between March 1949 and July 1953, he served as Central Committee Secretary with special responsibility for mass agitation and press matters. One important task undertaken by the Central Committee's Agitprop chief involved radio transmissions from East Germany, which he restructured, introducing a consistency of editorial focus to ensure broadcasts towed the party line. A large number of senior managers were dismissed from their broadcasters' offices in Berlin and replaced by people who were better trusted to politically conform. The June 1953 uprising shocked the East German leadership. East German news broadcasts played down the waves of violently suppressed strikes and street protests, but many listeners in and around Berlin were able to listen to radio reports transmitted from West Berlin and received a different story. The Central Committee felt unable to pretend that nothing was happening, but his public response concentrated on the Western broadcasts. Axen was able to deliver a reassuring statement that the Soviet government would intervene with the Western powers, and with its agents, roll up the whole West Berlin problem. Within days a major exercise in blame allocation followed, accompanied by dismissals and demotions in the East German government. Those whom Walter Ulbricht trusted most were those who had spent the Nazi years in Moscow, like he had. That fact Hermann Axen had chosen to flee to Paris, and not Moscow, in 1938 meant that while the country was led by Ulbricht, he would never be a full political insider. It was also obvious that the events of June 1953 had represented a major agitprop failure. Axen shared the responsibility for failing to curb the effectiveness of the ideological counter-offensive. He retained his membership in the Central Committee, but he was stripped of his secretarial responsibilities in it. He was also appointed, in succession to Erich Honecker, second secretary to the regional party leadership team for Berlin in July. In July 1956, he left his position with the party administration in Berlin. He was now appointed managing editor of Neues Deutschland, the party newspaper, and the most widely available daily newspaper in East Germany. He succeeded George Stiebe in the editorial position. Stiebe was in post for a year, but Axen remained managing editor till 1966. His decade in charge of the newspaper was the longest of any Neues Deutschland managing editor in the 20th century. In September 1956, he was awarded the Patriotic Order of Merit, and obvious that he was back in favor with the party. Further national awards followed over the next decade. He also served as a Berlin city councillor between 1963 and 1967. In 1966, with him having never lost his place in the party Central Committee, He was appointed Central Committee Secretary for International Relations, which made him one of the principal architects of East German foreign policy. His mandate also included matters involving the international communist and labor movements. He had been made a candidate for Politburo membership in January 1963. In 1970, he was elected to full membership, filling the vacancy arising through the illness and death of Paul Froelich. By this point, Walter Ulbricht was now in his mid-70s, and his position was beginning to weaken. When he dismissed Erich Honecker from his party post, he was immediately forced to reverse the decision, and reinstate Honecker. Honecker enjoyed the backing of Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev. In May 1971, the Soviets forced the resignation of Walter Ulbricht. Axen and Honecker had worked closely together in the late 1940s on the launch of the FDJ. They remained close friends, and between 1971 and 1989, as he used his Politburo position for international relations, Hermann's confidence and interpersonal skills, with his intellectual abilities, was matched by a political confidence from a leadership that respected and followed his judgments. Between November 1976 and 1989, he was a member of the Politburo's West Germany Working Group. Throughout his career, he also spoke at the National Memorial of the Liberation of Buchenwald concentration camp. He was also responsible for talks on disarmament that took place between East Germany's ruling SED Party and West Germany's SPD, which headed up that country's governing coalition between 1969 and 1982. He laid the diplomatic and practical foundations for Erich Honecker's visits to the West. Hermann stood out from the rest of East Germany's politicians. In East Germany, he was known both for his short height and as a very able and experienced foreign policy operator. From his days in Agitprop and his 10-year editorship of Neues Deutschland, he was respected when it came to effective mass communication. Western intelligence saw him as very pleasant, a polite and humorous individual, unlike most members of the East German Politburo. He was fluent in Russian, but also in French and English. Western intelligence also believed that he enjoyed the complete confidence of Erich Honecker, both on questions of foreign policy and in matters of socialist ideology and theory. Intelligence analysts speculated that the close relation between the two went back to their shared experiences. They had both suffered and served time in prison under the Nazi regime. They had started their party careers at the birth of the German Democratic Republic with their shared work on creating the FDJ. Western intel also received reports from informants that Axen suffered from an inferiority complex, and had terrible eyesight, suffering from diabetes and high blood pressure, and had been fitted with a pacemaker for his heart. He was on the team that accompanied Erich Honecker to Helsinki in 1975 for the conference that delivered the Helsinki Accords. He served between 1981 and 1989 as a member of the Politburo's Commission for Coordinating Economic, Cultural and Technical Scientific Relations with the countries of Asia, Africa and the Arabic region. He then served on the Presidium of the East German Peace Council between 1982 and 90. He was arrested on January 16, 1990, at Berlin Airport, as he arrived on a flight from Moscow, where he'd been to receive medical treatment. He was held on suspicion of corruption and abuse of office. His bank accounts, which he shared with his wife Sonia, were frozen. The arrest warrant was rescinded on January 31, due to his ill health. After German reunification, the Berlin District Court rejected an application by the state prosecutor to reopen the case on June 27, 1991. The prosecutor appealed the decision, but the application hadn't been heard by February 15, 1992. When he died of heart failure in Berlin, aged 75.